Hello everyone, it's time to spend too much time talking about Deathbringer today. It feels a little bit under the radar compared to Sand Lane and Riders of the Apocalypse, but this is actually my favorite of the Death Knight hero talent trees. Deathbringer nails every goal for hero talents. The gameplay loop is solid, giving us an extra button that complements the spec rotation without overshadowing it. All of the non-utility nodes in this tree connect to this loop, building up a single core concept. There are two main choices in this tree, and both look to be proper choices we can swap around to suit the situation. The utility choices do leave something to be desired, but hopefully a later beta build will address this. So let's dive in and go over what's going on in this tree. My goal here is to put some attention on how well this tree works and give you an idea of how this will play. As I go, there will be some clips showing off the visuals sprinkled between some footage of a stone vault run that shows it off. At the top here, we have Reaper's Mark, an active ability on a 1-minute cooldown that costs 2 runes. You press this button and it does an okay chunk of damage and applies Reaper's Mark to the target. Anytime you deal Shadow or Frost damage, your mark gains a stack. After 12 seconds or when reaching 40 stacks, the mark explodes, dealing damage per stack to the target. If the target dies while Reaper's Mark is active, it will jump to a nearby unmarked enemy. If no other targets are available, then Reaper's Mark will explode when the target hits 35% health. This execute explosion cannot occur again on a target for 3 minutes. So this is the pillar the tree is built around. Everything else builds into this core loop of pressing Mark and trying to get as many stacks as you can. The tooltip can get a little confusing there at the end. I think the intent of the bit at the end here is to make sure that you're always getting benefit from your mark, even when targets are dying too quickly for you to stack it or just living less than 12 seconds. The first part of it's pretty easy. It just jumps targets if it dies so that you don't have to make sure you're always casting on the highest health target. The other part is a little confusing to read. I've seen people get kind of tripped up on this and what this means. All it really does is trigger the explosion when the target hits 35% so that you can still benefit from the extra effects like Exterminate and Soul Rupture and Grim Reaper. It's definitely a little bit confusing to read at first. Really don't need to stress about this too much. Mostly it's just here for open world content or very easy delves. Moving on. Starting down at Wave of Souls here, Reaper's Mark calls out this oscillating wave of Shadow Frost bursts that deal damage both ways to all enemies caught in its path. Wave of Souls crits cause the enemies to take 5% increased Shadow Frost damage, stacking up to 2 times, and the wave back is always a critical strike. This sounds mostly just passive throughput. It does have some nice visual flair to it. The wave that goes out and come back is pretty distinct. The hits have a big radius, so you don't need to try too hard to aim it. It's not narrow. It's not like trying to make sure you've lined up Glacial Advance through all your targets. The increased Shadow Frost damage is a nice bit of throughput, but it's not something we would really be able to play around. We already like crit enough that it doesn't move the needle a whole lot on what stats we like. From there we go to Blood Fever. Your Frost Fever has a chance to deal 30% increased damage as Shadow Frost. Currently it's set at a 45% proc chance. And this proc is a separate damage event called Blood Fever. Adding Shadow Frost to our dot gives us a way to gain more stacks, as we will see in a little bit. Blood Fever is also a great example of how this tree is so good at folding everything back into the core pillar of Reaper's Mark. This isn't just a boring 15% disease damage on this tree. They made sure even a plain old dot buff hooks back into the other talents. And speaking of that, we'll see how that hook works with the next talent. Bind in Darkness, Shadow Frost damage applies 2 stacks to Reaper's Mark and 4 when it is a critical strike. Also, Rime Empowered Howling Blast deals Shadow Frost damage. Here we've got a big enabler for all of the hooks in this tree with Shadow Frost damage and Reaper's Mark stacking. This is where it's really all coming together. Bind in Darkness is how we're going to consistently push up to the stack cap for Reaper's Mark. Having it key off Shadow Frost damage means we're going to be on the lookout for things that give us extra Shadow Frost damage and give us more stacks. Of course, we're fans of the crit interaction here. Frost always likes crit, so this is something that rewards us for doing what we already like to do. Deathbringer excels at giving Frost these rewards just in general, kind of nailing the design goal they laid out. They stated that the design goal for hero talents is that they should complement the spec without overshadowing it. You feel like you should be playing your spec with a twist. Bind in Darkness embodies this really well by integrating with things we're already doing and rewarding us for continuing to do those things. So moving on to the next row, Soul Rupture. When Reaper's Mark explodes, it deals 20% of the damage dealt to nearby enemies. Enemies hit by this effect deal 5% reduced physical damage to you for 10 seconds. This is a nice bit of AoE that kind of goes in line with Wave of Souls right above it. The reduced damage effect is not super relevant to us as Frost. I'm sure there'll be situations where it'd be a nice to have, but I don't think we're going to be trying to time the Reaper's Mark around getting that damage reduction. The main thing for us is that it gets us some AoE benefit from Mark without Mark needing to be nerfed in single target to stop the scaling from going too crazy. If Mark worked in AoE, then it would be a balancing concern between making Mark feel impactful in AoE and doing good AoE damage against its single target output. And you kind of see this with Obliterate itself in Obliteration builds with Cleaving Strikes, where because Obliterate does so much of Obliteration's single target damage, when you clone that to multiple targets, it becomes oppressive to the damage profile. So Soul Rupture here is kind of designed to give us some AoE benefit, but without making Reaper's Mark oppressively strong in AoE. I really like how they've built AoE output into this tree without tying it directly to Reaper's Mark. This means that as tuning goes on, they should have lots of knobs to fine-tune the damage profile without needing to hurt, AoE because single target needs to come down and vice versa. Next, we've got Grim Reaper. It says Reaper's Mark Explosion deals up to 30% increased damage based on your target's missing health and applies Soul Reaper to targets below 35% health. This is a pretty cool talent. It's got great flavor that leans into Deathbringer being about picking a single target and focusing on them. The increased damage is currently bugged on alpha, so I'm assuming for now that it's just a linear increase with missing health on your target to give a nice bump to the explosion damage. And then that extra Soul Reaper gives us some more execute. This Soul Reaper is a total copy of a talented Soul Reaper, and so this means you can have both the talent and Grim Reaper active on a target at the same time. Not sure if this will make us a dominant execute spec, but I do like it fleshing out the execute damage profile. We kind of felt like we were just borrowing Soul Reaper from Unholy, and then eventually it just got buffed to where it's like, well, I guess we have execute damage now because this weird talent has just been buffed to be so strong. This talent combined with the flavor they're going for with Deathbringer rounds that out and makes it feel like Frost has its own execute damage now. Probably not, the best in the game, but something that will still be nice to play with. Now we have our first choice node in this tree, Death's Bargain and Rune Carved Plates. Death's Bargain is a passive node that triggers 50% effective Death Pact whenever you take 25% of your max HP in a single hit. This can only occur every 2 minutes, and when Mark explodes, the cooldowns of this effect and Death Pact are reduced by 5 seconds. I have not been able to test this properly on alpha. Finding something that does 25% damage in a single hit is tricky at the moment. Kind of just gotta wander around the open zones and see if something hits you for a high enough amount. As it reads, this doesn't sound very good. Assuming that the 50% effectiveness here applies to both the heal and the heal absorb part of Death Pact, you'd get a 25% heal that would leave an absorber at 15% of your max HP. This seems mostly good for open world content like questing, leveling, solo stuff, maybe delves, where you can pop this between packs and then wait for the heal absorb to drop off. In group content, when you're getting healed all the time, this ends up kind of being a weak heal that you don't have much control over. If you're getting chunked by like big ticks of damage, then this would go off early while your healers have cooldowns running, and then later on, like 30 seconds later, when your healer maybe doesn't have a cooldown running, you don't have this up, and it's not helping you. Not being able to control the heal, and when it's on a trigger as particular as 25% of your HP in one hit, you know, it's kind of like, yeah, sure, it is healing throughput, but if it's not coming at an important moment, what good is it really doing me? There's also the issue that if you want to get the full value from this talent, you need to also talent in the Death Pact, which we would prefer to avoid right now for kind of the reasons I said before. Death Pact is an okay emergency heal, but it's overall not a great defensive tool for us. This talent looks even worse when we compare it to Rune Carved Plates. Rune Carved Plates makes each rune spent reduce magic damage taken by 2%, and each rune generated reduces physical damage taken by 2% up to 5 seconds, stacking up to 5 times. This effectively works out to a permanent 10% damage reduction for all damage, as long as we can stay in combat spending runes. If we're spending runes, our natural rune regeneration and runic empowerment procs should keep the rune generation part of this talent active. Just reading it, it almost seems too strong. Like it is going to be just this constant 10% DR. I also do see the counter argument that if you have even a small amount of downtime, you go 5 seconds off the boss, you can't spend a rune, or the boss flies away and the stacks drop off, you've got to rebuild those. You don't have the DR up in that time. That does bring in the question, are you taking significant damage in that time? So this, well, I don't think that this is going to quite be the on all the time 10% DR that it reads as. It is still going to be up a whole lot. And when you compare it against Death's Bargain, there's really no contest here for what you want to take. Now, before going on to the next row, we should talk about Exterminate, because Exterminate informs how some of these talents work. So Exterminate says after Reaper's Mark explodes, your next obliteration costs no runes and summons 2 scythes to strike your enemies. The first scythe strikes your target for Shadow Frost damage and has a chance to apply Reaper's Mark. The second scythe strikes all enemies around your target for Shadow Frost damage. Exterminate brings the visual aspect of Deathbringer to life, addressing any concerns about Reaper's Mark not having a way to show a strong visual effect. There was a little bit of concern, I think, that we had when they showed the concept for Deathbringer, and you're wondering how are they going to do a good visual for this when the core mechanic is a stacking debuff. But I think they've really delivered with Exterminate, and importantly, Exterminate does damage to warrant the visual effect. While the mark itself should do more damage as long as you've stacked it up, this is still a hard-hitting effect in line with the visual. It's also got a little bit of randomness to it in what should be a fun way. That 20% chance to apply a mark will reduce the scripted feeling of Reaper's Mark. Every once in a while, you'll get that additional cast of Exterminate. Now, as far as I've seen in my testing and collecting hours of data from hitting dummies, the Reaper's Mark that gets applied by Exterminate cannot then proc another Reaper's Mark when its Exterminate hits. So you cannot chain proc off of a single mark. I also really like that Exterminate is tied to Obliterate and doesn't just automatically happen when the mark explodes. This lets you time when you use it and gives you some opportunity to, oh, let me hold this for a few seconds and I can hit more targets. Or this mob's about to die, I'm not going to get the full value of Exterminate, I can hold this, we'll go to the next pack, I'll open with Exterminate. The important thing here is that us, the player, has agency over Exterminate, and I think that does a lot to pull back on the feeling of Deathbringer just being this fully passive tree. Yes, in practicality, there's not a ton to think about with Reaper's Mark. It will ultimately work out to press mark on cooldown, play your normal rotation, and that's in line with what they've said they want hero talents to be. But I do appreciate that they have found ways to at least offer a feeling of more control to players. So with that out of the way, we can now look at Swift End and Painful Death. Swift End reduces the cost of Reaper's Mark by 1 rune and reduces its cooldown by 30 seconds. Painful Death makes Reaper's Mark do 10% increased damage, And Exterminate empowers an additional Obliterate, but now reduces its cost by 1 rune. Additionally, Exterminate now has a 30% chance to apply Reaper's Mark. So not only does Exterminate have an increased chance to apply Reaper's Mark, but you're now getting 2 Exterminates with Painful Death. And so this works out to about a 50% chance to proc another mark per cast, which balances very nicely against Swift End. Swift End and Painful Death are balanced very closely against each other on paper, netting you, on average, the same amount of Reaper's Marks as the fight goes on. And so this means that we can take the talent that will best suit the content we're doing or suits our personal preference. Most of the time, we'll probably want to take Swift End, just because it gets us a consistent stream of marks more often. But if we know we're doing something where, for some reason, we can't use Reaper's Mark every 30 seconds, then we can go into Painful Death and not have that cooldown reduction go to waste. Or if you're someone who just likes gambling for procs and trying to get that high roll, then you can go for Painful Death. Painful Death does have more variance to it, so you'll have some pulls where it does a lot for you, you'll have some pulls where it does a little, but on average these both work out the same, and I'm really happy to see Painful Death end up where it is compared to the first version where it looked like we would take Swift End all the time no matter what. Next choice node is Dark Talons and Wither Away. Dark Talons gives Killing Machine or Rhyme a 25% chance to increase the maximum stacks of a nice active Icy Talons by 1 up to 2 times. While Icy Talons is active, your runic power spending abilities also count as Shadow Frost damage. Dark Talons links back to the Frost Spec tree. More stacks of Icy Talons pairs well with Smothering Offense and the rest of that auto attack line. This results in us getting a pretty sizable increase to attack speed when everything is all stacked up. It also gives us interesting gameplay hook by connecting back to Bind in Darkness. If we're doing Shadow Frost damage, then we're getting more stacks on our mark and doing more damage with it. Ultimately, this benefit is going to depend on how easy or hard it is to get 40 stacks, as well as the uptime you can keep on Icy Talons. One thing I've got my eye on is that when you lose your Icy Talon stacks, you then have to roll again to get those 2 stacks of Dark Talons to increase your maximum Icy Talons stacks to 5 or 7, depending on what you've taken in the spec tree. This can make it quite punishing if you lose your stacks. And yes, it does seem to kind of obviously lean into Breathless and Dragosa with the runic power effect, but at the same time, Breath is looking to clock in at about a 30-second duration now, and Reaper's Mark being on a 30 to 60-second cooldown means we won't be able to juice a mark with Breathless and Dragosa every time. In fact, we'll only be able to juice 1 out of every 3 or 4 marks with Breathless and Dragosa. So that, combined with the concern about downtime, makes this less of a clear winner than I thought it was when they first showed the tree. Meanwhile, Wither Away makes your Frost Fever do its damage in half the duration, and Exterminate applies Frost Fever. The Exterminate part is less exciting because it's very easy to apply Frost Fever, but Frost Fever doing the same damage in half the time is exciting. It effectively doubles the damage of Frost Fever and potentially links to Cryogenic Chamber. Frost Fever normally ticks once every 3 seconds, and in single target, this is not enough to fill up Cryogenic Chamber before Remorseless Winter comes off cooldown. So Wither Away potentially gives us an angle to get more value out of Cryogenic Chamber. Wither Away also offers us a wee throughput in a talent tree weighted towards single target. That's always good. At the initial review, Wither Away seemed to be pretty overshadowed by Dark Talons, but it's exciting to see that it actually has some strong use cases and scenarios where it will beat out Dark Talons. We want these choice nodes to be genuine choices that we pick to suit the content, and we don't want to see them be something that we pick one and never change. So I'm quite pleased by both of the main choices in this tree shaping up to be genuine choices. Last utility node is a choice node. We have Death's Messenger reducing the cooldown on Lichborn and Raise Dead by 30 seconds. And then we've got Expelling Shield. When an enemy deals direct damage to your anti-magic shell, their cast speed is reduced by 10% for 6 seconds. Right now, this node is pretty much a no contest. You take Death Messenger every time. It's not exciting, but it's at least something. Expelling Shield feels like a whole lot of nothing right now. The way it works is kind of counterintuitive. In order for an enemy to damage the anti-magic shell, they have to do magic damage to you. That usually means you have to let a cast go through. So to get value from this, you need to put yourself in this weird situation. You let a cast go through, and then there's going to be a dangerous cast within 6 seconds that you would then be able to stop. The cast speed reduction is only good if it lets you stop a cast you otherwise wouldn't be able to, but this is such a slight reduction in such a narrow window. And the way you proc it's so weird. I'm not sure where we would ever use this. I don't even think in PvP you would use this. I think this talent needs to change. When I wrote my first impressions for this, I pitched the idea of turning it into Mirror Ball. Expelling Shield sounds like what Mirror Ball did, but we've got that on the class tree now, so I'm not sure what else Expelling Shield should be, but it definitely needs to do something more impactful than the nothing it does right now. We've already covered Exterminate, so that wraps up our review of each of these talents. Overall, I'm happy with Deathbringer as a hero talent tree. The gameplay feels good for both Breath and Obliteration builds. My top concern at the initial reveal was Obliteration would struggle to stack it consistently to the cap, but this is not the case. So far in everything I've been able to test, it's not been a real problem to stack these up. Sometimes you get unlucky and maybe you only get 35 stacks, but generally it's not an issue to get plenty of stacks. Reaper's Mark is a short cooldown that requires some attention, but it stays out of the way of the core rotation. It is powerful enough and pays for its own resources via Exterminate to ward off any concerns that we might want to sit on Reaper's Mark to cast other things instead. The stacks come quickly, and most of the time it isn't an issue to hit the 40 stack cap. The predictability of getting this stacks can sometimes make the tree feel a little passive, but I think this is the right direction. Stacking up marks should not overthrow our existing priorities, making the spec even more complex to learn. With the 2 weapon sets, each having their own builds, Frost does not need hero talents, adding a layer of rotational complexity to memorize. And this is what Blizzard's given as their intent for hero talents. They're supposed to be complementary. They're not supposed to overshadow or overrule the spec you're playing. The utility nodes in Deathbringer are a mixed bag, but the nodes that all link back to Reaper's Mark itself do so in a really satisfying way. Everything feeds back into the core loop. Cast Mark, stack it up, unleash Exterminate. Some of the talents have the potential to change up how we build our spec tree, but they do this in a way that's more about trying to min-max. It's not about you need to take this talent or Deathbringer doesn't function. The spec tree does not get warped by running Deathbringer. The visuals and flavor are top-notch for Death Knights. Deathbringer is described as an emissary of death, aiming for enemy souls and vanquishing them. Reaper's Mark and all of the effects that feed into it play into this fantasy well, in my opinion. There's no disjointed mechanics like Blood Beast just kind of feeling stuffed into Sand Lane. Overall, making this my favorite of the DK hero talents by far. Everything about this is really well done. When I read the blue posts giving intent and design principles for the hero talents, they knock it out of the park on every one of those with Deathbringer. I personally would put this up there as one of the best hero trees, period. I know Deathbringer is not exactly a strong sub-spec fantasy for Death Knights in the way that something like Dark Ranger might be for hunters. For me, the great gameplay and great design matter more in the end, and I'm really looking forward to getting to play this in challenging content when the War Within goes live.